All right, so let's get into this deep dive.
Yeah.
You gave us a ton of documents all about government reform from a conservative perspective.
Yeah, lots to dig into here.
We're going to unpack the core ideas here, see what's really going on, and think about how it all might affect you.
Right, and especially given your experience with government and as someone who identifies with multiple minority groups.
Exactly. We want to make this relevant to you.
Absolutely.
So let's start with the big one. You shared this mandate for leadership thing.
Yeah, Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise. It's from the Heritage Foundation.
Okay.
Think of it as like a blueprint for a future conservative president. You know, they're outlining how they want to change the government.
They're laying out their ideal situation then.
Exactly. Their vision for a smaller federal government and a return to traditional values.
Hmm. Interesting. So like a wish list almost.
Kinda,
Yeah.
yeah. But it raises the question, how realistic is this vision?
Right. And what would it mean for someone like our listener who might not fit neatly into their mold?
That's a key question we need to explore. Right from the start, the document sets a particular tone.
Okay. How so?
It evokes the Reagan era. You know, they're trying to appeal to those who see that time as a golden age of conservative governance.
Ah, so there's that nostalgia factor.
Definitely. But it's not just a history lesson. They're proposing some pretty significant changes for today.
So what are some of the big ideas they're putting forward?
Two major themes stand out. First, they identify China as the top threat to U.S. national security.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah,
That's a common concern these days.
right. And they argue for a big increase in defense spending and a push to bring manufacturing back to America.
Yeah. So they see economic competition with China as a national security issue, too.
Exactly. It's all connected. And that ties into their second big theme, the breakdown of the American family.
Interesting. So they're linking economic and social issues, framing them both as existential threats.
Right. They see them as intertwined and fundamental to the strength of the nation.
But what does that mean practically? What kind of government interventions are they proposing?
Well, they advocate for policies that promote what they call traditional family structures.
Okay. What does that mean exactly?
Things like eliminating marriage penalties in welfare and taxes.
So incentivizing marriage and traditional family units.
Exactly. Now, how this resonates with you as someone from an intersectional background is something we should really think about.
For sure, traditional family values can mean different things to different people.
Right. And those definitions haven't always been inclusive.
Exactly. So how might these pronouncements land with someone who doesn't fit that narrow definition of family?
It's a good question. The document doesn't really engage with the complexities of modern families or the experiences of those who don't conform to traditional norms.
So it's a bit of a blind spot then.
You could say that.
Okay, so they've laid out their concerns. China, the family, and kind of by extension, the size and scope of the federal government itself. So what's the solution?
Their core theme is shrinking the federal government.
Classic conservative approach.
Yeah, they want to return power to states' local communities, and they emphasize this a lot, families and faith-based organizations.
So less government intervention, more power at the local level.
Exactly. They envision a less intrusive federal government with a smaller role in regulating the economy and social life.
It all sounds good in theory, but how do they actually plan to shrink the federal government? What are the mechanics of it?
They advocate for a pretty bold use of executive power.
Interesting. So they're putting a lot of faith in the presidency.
Definitely. They believe a conservative president can use executive orders, appointments, and budget cuts to reshape or even dismantle parts of the federal bureaucracy.
That's a lot of power concentrated in one person.
It is. And it raises the question, what happens if that power is used in ways that harm or disadvantage certain groups?
Right. Especially those who might not align with those conservative values.
Exactly. That's a valid concern. The document assumes a conservative president will act in the best interests of all Americans.
But it doesn't really address the potential for abuse of power.
No, it doesn't.
not?
Or the need for checks and balances to protect everyone's rights.
Right. It's a bit of a leap of faith.
Yeah, you could say that.
All right, so let's get into the specifics. They propose changes to a whole range of departments and agencies.
Yeah, a lot of them.
Which ones are most likely to directly affect you and your communities?
Well, let's start with the Department of Homeland Security. This is a big one.
So this one comes to immigration, right?
Exactly. They want to see a shift away from what they call open border policies.
Okay.
And they specifically propose restoring USCIS to primarily a screening and vetting agency.
So less focus on pathways to citizenship or supporting immigrants already here.
Yeah, more emphasis on keeping people out.
How would that impact immigrant communities?
Yeah.
especially those already facing so many barriers.
It's a critical question. This emphasis on security could have significant consequences.
Like what?
Potentially more deportations, stricter enforcement, fewer resources for integration and support services.
It's a perspective that seems to prioritize border control over the needs of immigrants.
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay, what about FEMA? They talk about reforming that too.
Right, FEMA is the agency that handles disaster response. They want to prioritize federalism and state and local preparedness.
So potentially reducing the federal role in disaster response.
Exactly. It's in line with their goal of shrinking the federal government.
But what happens when states don't have the resources to respond effectively?
That's a good point, especially when disasters disproportionately affect marginalized communities.
Right. We've seen how important federal assistance can be.
Definitely. And the document doesn't really address those potential disparities or the consequences of shrinking the federal safety net.
So it's a bit of a gap in their thinking then.
You could say that they focus on the principle of limited government.
But not always on the practical implications.
Right.
And what about the Department of Homeland Security itself? Do they want to keep it, or is there something more drastic in mind?
Actually, they suggest the possibility of shrinking or even eliminating DHS altogether.
Wow. That's a pretty big change.
It is. They argue the department has become bloated and ineffective.
So they see an opportunity to streamline national security functions.
Exactly. But dismantling such a massive department would be a huge undertaking.
It would. What would that even look like?
Yeah.
And what are the potential risks and benefits, especially for vulnerable communities?
They don't give a detailed plan, but they do mention a soft closure of ineffective offices as a first step.
So shifting resources to the most essential functions.
Yeah, and potentially breaking up the department into smaller, more manageable units.
But would that actually improve security? Or could it create gaps and weaken essential functions?
It's debatable. The document seems to assume that smaller is always better.
But as we've seen, that's not always the case.
Right, especially when it comes to protecting vulnerable communities.
It seems like a lot of their proposals are based on that assumption, though. Smaller government is inherently better.
It's a core principle for them. But it's important to consider how that squares with the reality that many marginalized communities rely on federal programs and protections.
Exactly. It's a tension that runs throughout this whole document.
Definitely.
Okay, let's shift gears to another area that's especially relevant to your experience. Education. What are they proposing for the Department of Education?
Their big focus is education freedom.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
Basically, greater school choice and portability of federal funding.
So giving parents more options.
Right. Empowering them to choose the schools they think are best for their children.
Whether that's public, private, or charter schools.
Exactly.
School choice is a complex issue, though.
It is. And it's often framed as a way to empower parents.
But it's also been criticized for potentially undermining public schools and making inequality worse.
Right. Especially in communities that are already underserved.
Given your own experience with the education system, how do you see this playing out?
It's crucial to consider the potential consequences for equity and access. The document doesn't really address those concerns.
So they focus on the idea of parental choice.
Yeah, but they don't get into how to ensure quality education for all students or prevent disadvantaged schools from losing resources.
And what about those other reforms they mentioned, like for charter schools, student loans, and Title IX?
Yeah.
Anything in there that stands out to you?
Yes, definitely the changes they propose to Title IX regulations.
That's the law that prohibits sex-based discrimination in education.
Right. Right. And they want to shift the focus towards parental rights and push back against what they see as overreach on gender identity issues.
That could have a big impact on LGBTQ plus students.
It could, potentially rolling back protections and making it harder for them to access support.
It also raises questions about the balance between parental rights and the well-being of students who might not feel safe at home.
Exactly. It highlights how these policy proposals can have very real consequences for individual students and their families.
It's not just about ideology, it's about people's lives.
Exactly. And we need to keep that human element in mind as we unpack these proposals.
All right, well, we've covered a lot of ground already, from national security to education.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
There's still so much more to explore, including their proposals for the Department of Justice, which is always a hot topic.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. We'll dive into those in the next part of our deep dive.
So stay tuned. We'll be back soon to continue unpacking this conservative vision for America.
It's going to be interesting. Okay, so the Department of Justice.
The DOJ, big one. Lots to unpack there.
Yeah, for sure. Where do we even begin?
I guess let's start with their vision for the FBI. That's always a hard topic.
Yeah, they really want to refocus the FBI on its core mission.
Which is?
Law enforcement, pure and simple, investigating and prosecuting federal crimes.
So less of that shadowy intelligence gathering stuff?
Yeah.
More like a classic crime-fighting agency.
Exactly. That's the idea. They want to see a clear line between intelligence and law enforcement.
But how would that affect the FBI's ability to address threats that are relevant to marginalized communities?
Yeah.
Things like hate crimes or domestic terrorism.
It's a good question. They do talk about intelligence gathering, but they want to make sure it's separate from traditional law enforcement.
Okay.
They argue the FBI has gotten too involved in areas like online speech, venturing into combating misinformation.
Ah, yes. The misinformation debate.
Right. Everyone's got a different definition.
What's their take on it? And how might their approach impact someone like our listener who might be more vulnerable to online harassment or the spread of harmful stereotypes?
They're worried about censorship, basically. They think the FBI shouldn't be policing online speech or pressuring social media platforms to remove content.
Even if that content is harmful to certain groups.
They argue that existing laws are enough to address genuinely harmful content.
Like hate speech or incitement to violence.
Right. And they think giving the FBI broad authority to police online speech is dangerous, like a slippery slope towards censorship.
It is a tricky balance, right? Free speech versus protecting vulnerable communities.
Exactly.
How do they propose to strike that balance, especially with all the online hate speech and disinformation that targets minority groups?
They don't really offer any specific solutions for that. They just argue that focusing on traditional law enforcement and raising the bar for FBI intervention will protect both free speech and public safety.
So they think the FBI should only get involved when there's clear evidence of a crime.
Right. Not just unpopular or offensive speech.
It seems like they're putting a lot of faith in the existing legal framework.
They are. They think it's enough.
But what about the concerns that marginalized communities have raised about those laws being inadequate and the difficulty of holding people accountable?
The document doesn't really address those concerns.
It's a bit of a blind spot again.
You could say that they focus on the principle of limited government and the potential for overreach.
But they don't really engage with the lived experiences of those who've been targeted by this stuff.
Right. They seem to prioritize free speech, even when it comes at the expense of safety and well-being for some groups.
Okay, so that's their vision for the FBI's role in the digital age.
Yeah, more or less.
What about the FBI more broadly? They talk about streamlining the agency internally, too,
Yeah,
right?
they want to shift some functions to the Department of Justice.
Okay, which ones?
Non-law enforcement stuff, like legal counsel and congressional affairs.
So less of a standalone agency, more integrated into the DOJ.
Right. They see it as a way to improve oversight and accountability.
But would it actually make the FBI more accountable? Or could it just bury those oversight functions within a bigger bureaucracy?
It's hard to say. It could go either way. It depends on how they do it.
And what safeguards are put in place?
Exactly. The document assumes that bringing those functions under the DOJ will naturally lead to more transparency.
But it doesn't really explore the potential downsides.
No, it doesn't.
It's a reminder that structural changes don't automatically guarantee accountability.
For sure. You need a real commitment to transparency and oversight.
Regardless of who's in charge. Okay, let's move on to another area that's super relevant to your life and your communities. Healthcare. What are they saying about the Department of Health and Human Services?
HHS is a huge department, obviously.
Covers a lot of ground.
Yeah. The document focuses on two main programs, though. Medicaid and Medicare.
Ah, yes. Medicaid and Medicare. Those are massive programs.
Huge. Millions of Americans rely on them.
Especially those from lower-income backgrounds and marginalized communities.
Exactly. So any changes to those programs could have a big impact.
What kind of changes are they proposing?
They talk a lot about individual choice and provider freedom.
There.
They want reforms that encourage competition and innovation.
So more of a free market approach.
Yeah. They want to empower individuals to choose their own healthcare plans and providers.
Rather than relying on government-run systems.
Exactly.
But how would that affect those who rely on these programs as a safety net? Wouldn't it make them more vulnerable? Especially if they can't afford healthcare or don't know how to navigate a more complex system?
It's a valid concern. And the document doesn't really address those potential downsides.
So they're focused on the theoretical benefits of choice and competition.
Yeah, but they don't get into the practical implications for those who might struggle.
It's a perspective that seems to prioritize market forces over the idea of healthcare as a right.
You could say that.
How do they reconcile that view with the reality of healthcare disparities? The need to ensure equitable access to care, regardless of income or background.
They don't offer any specific solutions for that.
Mm.
They argue that a more competitive healthcare market will ultimately benefit everyone.
But it's not clear how that would actually work.
Right, especially for those who are already marginalized.
It seems like they're assuming the market will magically fix everything.
Kinda, yeah.
Hmm.
But history suggests that's not how it works.
Okay, let's move on to another department that affects a lot of people's lives. The Department of Agriculture.
The USDA. This is where their ideas about traditional values and limited government really come into play. They want to see the USDA return to its core functions:
Which are?
research information dissemination and addressing threats to food safety.
So less regulation of farmers, more support.
Exactly.
But what about things like environmental protection, climate change, and equity in farming? Those are all big issues that the USDA has been involved with.
They're actually critical of that.
Really?
Yeah, they see it as an overreach, a departure from the USDA's traditional mission.
They call it the Biden administration's transformational approach.
Right, and they're not fans.
So what's their problem with it?
They think the focus on things like climate change and equity has distracted from the core goal of supporting farmers and ensuring a safe and affordable food supply.
So it's a classic ideological clash then.
Yeah, limited government versus a more active role for the government.
Traditional values versus a more progressive agenda.
Exactly.
But how does their vision address the concerns about the environmental impact of agriculture and the need to make the food system more sustainable and equitable?
They don't really address those concerns directly. They argue that a more market-driven approach with less government intervention will lead to better outcomes.
For everyone.
That's their belief. They think farmers know best how to manage their own land.
And that government regulations just stifle innovation and drive up costs.
Right.
It's a perspective that prioritizes individual liberty and economic efficiency.
Over collective action to address systemic challenges.
Like climate change and food insecurity.
Exactly.
But what about the potential negative consequences of less regulation, like environmental damage or exploitation of farm workers?
They don't really offer solutions for that.
It seems like they're assuming those problems will just solve themselves.
Or that they're not that big of a deal.
It's a pretty optimistic view of the...
Well, it's all about shifting the balance of power, right? They want a smaller, less intrusive federal government.
Okay.
More emphasis on individual liberty-free markets and traditional values.
Less big government, more personal responsibility.
Exactly. That's the idea.
But how does that vision square with the realities of inequality? And the needs of marginalized communities who often rely on government programs and protections?
That's the key question. And honestly, one that the document doesn't fully address. They kind of assume that shrinking the government and empowering individuals will benefit everyone equally.
But we know that's not always how it works.
Right. History shows us that a smaller government can sometimes leave vulnerable people more exposed.
Yeah, it sounds appealing on the surface. Less bureaucracy, more freedom, lower taxes.
Right.
But it's really about who benefits and who loses out.
Exactly, and how those changes are implemented.
They also talk a lot about strong executive leadership.
Yeah, they've practically romanticized the idea of a decisive conservative president coming in and shaking things up.
But isn't that a lot of power for one person? Especially given what we've talked about regarding the potential impact on marginalized communities.
Absolutely. It's a valid concern. They see a strong executive as essential for pushing through their agenda.
Overcoming the bureaucracy and all that.
Right. But it does raise questions about abuse of power and the need for checks and balances.
What about Congress and the courts? Do they have a role in this vision?
They acknowledge the other branches, but they definitely prioritize executive action as the main driver of change.
It makes you wonder about their commitment to a balanced system of government.
It does. Especially if those reforms aren't implemented carefully.
This whole deep dive has been a fascinating look into how conservatives think about government.
Yeah, it's a complex and challenging vision.
And it raises a lot of questions, especially for someone like you who sees the world from an intersectional perspective.
Absolutely. It's a perspective that prioritizes certain values: individual liberty, limited government, traditional ways of life.
But it doesn't always engage with the realities of inequality or the need for a strong safety net.
Right. And it places a lot of faith in the idea that a smaller government led by a strong executive will just naturally make things better for everyone.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is. And it's important to think critically about these ideas.
So what stood out to you most after going through all this?
I think what's interesting is how this document forces us to confront our own assumptions about government.
Mhm.
Like, where do we draw the line between individual freedom and collective responsibility?
Right.
How do we balance a strong government with protecting individual rights?
Those are big questions.
They are, and they're questions that every citizen should be thinking about.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Well, we've given you a lot to chew on today,
a lot.
and it's just the beginning. This is a conversation that's going to continue.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
The important thing is that you use this knowledge to inform your own thinking.
Right. Engage in the debate. Be part of the solution.
Exactly. Because a well-informed citizenry is crucial for a healthy democracy.
Couldn't agree more. The more we understand about these issues, the better choices we can make.
As individuals and as a society.
Exactly.
So that's it for this deep dive. It's been a journey, exploring a particular vision for America.
A conservative vision.
But the conversation doesn't end here. Now it's up to you to decide where you stand
What resonates with your values?
and how you want to get involved.
Stay informed. Stay engaged.
That's what it's all about. Thanks for joining us.